Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm doing this sort of pseudo podcast thing. I'm calling it MF Talks. You know, it definitely looks better reading it than saying it out loud, but you know, MF Talks, Micro Four Thirds. Anyway, I want to welcome to the channel Griffin Hammond. If you somehow haven't heard of him, he's a documentarian, indie filmmaker, host of the Hey Indie Filmmaker podcast, one of my personal favorites. He's also a YouTuber and a official Twitch streamer as well, so he basically does everything. So anyway, Griffin, welcome to the show, podcast, whatever you want to call it.
Thank you for having me on MF Talks. It does sound bad.
I know, I've got to think of a better way to say it. MF Micro Four Talks, you know, the name's a work in progress.
I'm glad to be here. And you are a talented filmmaker and videographer in your own right. And I just want to point out to the audience that you helped me out at two very important moments in my career. You helped me shoot a 1-hour crash course that I have on filmmaking. And you also helped me shoot behind the scenes when Panasonic gave me a GH5 Mark II for the first time. What's funny is I have the GH5 Mark II in front of me, and the serial number on this camera is 2.
Whoa. That's like a collector's item,
I guess it's the second one, yeah.
Yeah, wow. That's something else. I wonder who has number 1. We'll have to reach out. If someone knows who has GH5 Mark II number 1, let us know.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're here not to talk about the GH5 Mark II as much, but to talk about the GH6. So, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the GH6 myself, and I know a lot of people have been asking me to review it, asking me if I'm going to get it, and I just really haven't been able to come up with an answer for them because I'm not 100% sure. And so I figured instead of, you know, trying for us to collaborate and figure out who should buy this camera, who shouldn't, I thought I'd just walk through mine and your thought process on whether we're going to pick up this camera. So, yeah, are you going to? Are you not going to pick up the GH6, and why?
Well, for me, it's a probably not. And but I also come from like a spoiled, privileged like place where Panasonic has generally given me all the cameras I own. I think I bought the GH1, the GH2, the GH3, the GH4, and then pretty much after that, they've been handing me cameras to test out. And so if I get a GH6, it'll probably be because Panasonic gives me one. But I certainly don't need any of the features. I mean, there's exciting features it has, and probably the one I'd be most interested to try out is the high speed. I mean, just the upgraded frame rates are very interesting to me, more so than the upgraded resolutions. But, you know, you don't need 5.7K to tell a story that you could tell in 4K. And so the GH5 and the GH5 Mark II still make me very happy.
Yeah, I'm really in the same boat. And I think the moment I realized I didn't really need it was going to the user manual or to B&H's, you know, spec sheet and trying to find how low the resolutions and bit rates went, you know, because a lot of the stuff I do is weddings and things like that, where I've got to upload an entire wedding day to a Google Drive or Dropbox or something for the people I shoot for up here. So obviously on my Mark II, on my S5, I'm shooting, you know, the 20 to 30 megabits per second modes, which is probably crazy to some people, but just for the efficiency and how many weddings some of these companies do, they're like, just shoot the lowest resolution, and with my internet speeds, it's the same story. So when I realized, like, does the GH6 shoot bad enough video for me to be able to use it for most of my work, I was like, maybe this camera's not for me, you know?
Well, yeah, weddings are like where you and I converge, because I also did weddings. I've done a lot of weddings in the past, and now I mostly do documentary style work, but it's the same sort of problem. We're shooting hours and hours and hours and hours of footage to tell even if it's a 5-minute story. Whereas if you're doing narrative filmmaking or making commercials, maybe it is fun to shoot in 5.7K in ProRes and, you know, take up as much space as you want. They're going to add the ability to use a solid state drive on this camera, and that would be really cool. But not when you're sending it all over the cloud to someone else to edit.
Yeah, it's, and again, it's not just the bit rates, the resolutions. It's exactly what you said, you know. I mean, most of my impressions of the camera are positive, and I don't want anyone to get that mistaken. You know, I did a video about why people are mixed on the GH6 release, and a lot of people took that as me being negative about the camera, but I was just saying, like, it's a little bit harder of a camera to understand than some of the previous releases. And so I look at the features and they're mostly positive for me, but there's only 2 or 3 that are like essential big changes for me. The rest are either like I'm going to have to wait and see how much I would use it, or it would just be cool. I'm like, yeah, it'd be cool to take a 100 megapixel high res image, but I'm never going to use that for my work. You know, 5.7K might be cool. Not really going to use it. 4K 120, I've never needed it before. So just a lot of things that I'm like, could be great in niche situations, but it's not going to like revolutionize my workflow or do any amazing benefits for me, other than maybe like the improved low light, which seems to be maybe a stop better than the GH5, which is cool because the GH5 was a stop better than the GH4. But me and you are going to be lighting a lot of things as well. So
well, and there's 3 kinds of questions I get from people, and I think you would answer them each differently about which camera to upgrade to. It's like, if you are buying a camera, if you need a camera right now and you don't have a camera, the GH6 is attractively priced and it's a great camera. So like, if you can afford it, you should certainly get it. But then the other kind of question I get is like, well, should I upgrade? And it's like, well, if you have a GH5, it's a great camera. You probably don't need to upgrade. And then the third kind of question I get from people is like, well, I need a camera, but I also want to save money. And they're looking at like used GH5s or GH4s. And it's like, yeah, if you're in that market, then you certainly don't need the most advanced features in the new camera. So I think it just depends on where you're coming from and how much money you have to spend. But yeah, I mean, get the GH6 if you can, if it looks good, if the price looks good to you, it's a great camera. You're going to get an amazing camera.
Right. And that was actually, you know, we just touched on it a little bit, but I was thinking a lot about good alternatives, which you mentioned just now. So, could you elaborate a little bit on maybe 1 or 2 of those specific cameras you might recommend if someone is getting into the same sort of stuff we're getting into?
Yeah, I mean, I've used every one of the GH series cameras. I also have an S1, and I prefer the smaller form factor on these cameras. I mean, here I'm holding the GH4, which came out many years ago. And I had a guy ask me this last week. I think I got like 2 questions from people about like older cameras that they might want to buy. And someone was wondering about the GH4. And, you know, I'm sure you can get great prices on a used GH4. But my only advice to him was the jump from the GH4 to the GH5 was so big, going from, I mean, they're both 4K cameras. They both shoot great 4K video. But the GH5 here, same form factor, I mean, maybe slightly bigger. It has the in-body image stabilization. And so it's kind of like, if you're going to shoot any handheld shooting, you know, like at a wedding, if you're going to be handheld at all, the image stabilization in the GH5 is so good that it makes the GH4 look jittery by comparison. All the footage I look at from 2016, when I was still shooting on GH4, I kind of cringe a little bit because it just looks a little bit shaky. And so that was my warning to him, is like, you might want to stick with GH5 and up, just because I think the in-body image stabilization is such a game changer. And that's kind of like what's missing from the GH6 is like, there wasn't like a gigantic, you know, like a very important jump forward that kind of changes the way your footage actually looks to the end user.
Right. And, you know, I use the GH4 still. I recently convinced my brother to buy it. He's, you know, a travel guy. He's always doing these adventures. And I said, you know, GH4 and the 14 to 140 and the 25 millimeter is super cheap, 4K, weather sealed, you know, stuff you don't get on most cameras even to this day. And if you got a lens with stabilization, it's still not bad, but yeah, even just the IBIS, and the GH5 is better than most lens stabilization from the GH4 era. But yeah, the GH4 is an amazing camera. Like I said, I've got it as my C camera for weddings. I'm probably going to get another one or an equivalent camera for a D camera. And yeah, unless you need the IBIS or the 10-bit, you know, because the GH4 is still just an 8-bit camera, which is not the best for like heavy color grade stuff. But otherwise, it's still a super competent camera in almost every respect. And yes, generally what I think is the biggest thing with the GH6 for most people is it's going to be price drops and used copies of all of the older cameras from the people that did end up upgrading. So that's a great opportunity for a lot of people. I mean, I picked up my GH5 Mark II, for example, at the reduced, which seems to be the permanent reduced price of about $200 off of the original price. And I've been super happy with that. And that was me going from the GH5 to the GH5 Mark II. If you're going from the GH4 or an even older camera to the GH5 or GH5 Mark II, that's going to be a huge jump, in my opinion. And I couldn't recommend it enough.
Well, and the GH5 Mark II, I'm kind of in love with that camera because, I mean, it's such a simple thing, but the USB-C charging to me is kind of a game-changing feature just because it means that you can plug in, you know, I never have to take the batteries out to charge them if I don't want to. I can just charge through USB-C. You can use that as your like AC power. It's great for live streaming. You can just leave it on the tripod and it's always plugged in. And so I love the GH5, and then the Mark II just added like little features like that just make it so much more usable in a variety of situations. So I guess it's kind of hard for me not to recommend the GH5 Mark II. And yeah, if you can get it for $200 less or buy one used, I'm sure it's a great deal.
Yeah, for me, the two things for me as a wedding guy and someone who really likes to shoot in vlog these days is 4K 60 has the 10-bit now, which is great because the 8-bit was always rough. I'd have to switch to 1080p 60 for the 10-bit footage, which was fine. I've resed 1080p up to 4K all the time, and no one has ever and will ever notice. And then the ability to go down to negative 18 dBs for the audio. You know, some of these weddings are so loud I could never get decent audio just because the older cameras always ran a little hot. But just those two little upgrades with, you know, a few others like the thing you mentioned made me realize that GH5 Mark II might be the camera for me over the GH6, at least for now. I'm sure, I have a feeling we're both going to end up with it, but it's definitely doesn't seem urgent that we run out and get the GH6 like next week or anything like that.
Well, and I've always liked the small form factor on these cameras, and the GH6 is a little bit bigger. I mean, they had to add a fan because it's so processor intensive that it needs to cool that down. So they made the whole body just a little bit thicker. And you know, if I need the ProRes and if I need the 5.7K and if I need the high frame rate, then yeah, I'll jump to it. But it's like, I always say that about cameras, that you should not upgrade until you've plateaued with your camera. Like you've reached the limit of what it's capable of. If you are someone who's like, man, I wish I had more resolution, I wish I had more frames per second, and my current camera is holding me back, then yes, go get that new camera. But I think you have to ask yourself, like, why are you upgrading? Because, you know, if you're still like just going to be shooting 30 all the time or 24, and what you really need to do is improve your lighting or your audio, like go do those things before you just like upgrade your bit rates. That's not going to do a lot for you as a storyteller.
Yeah, I have this hierarchy of gear that I usually use for renting things, but I should try to use more in my personal life, which is, you know, I can make any camera and lens look great with good lighting. I can make any camera look great with a great lens and great lighting. So if you know, it's buy more lights, buy more lenses, and then buy a new camera at the very bottom. And that's the same for renting and purchasing, in my opinion. And so, yeah, you know, when I look at the GH6 and I realize I can buy 3 more lights or a 4th camera and a new lens for it as well, it's hard to justify, you know, the slight bumps in a lot of categories, which again could be significant to some people, could be not quite as significant to the majority of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's like us filmmaker pixel peeper people like to dissect this stuff, but like the end viewer has no idea what a GH6 looks like. They're never gonna be like, this footage is clearly shot on a GH6 in 5.7K. Like no one can see this stuff. they don't know if you're shooting on an Alexa or an iPhone, really. And so and likewise, they're not going to know which microphone you recorded on or which lights. Like, as long as you're hitting the fundamentals and coming away with footage that looks clean, no one really cares, about the little details.
People say, man, this shot's grainy. Oh, the Panasonic cameras are bad in low light, which they're not. I think, but I always say to people, like, yeah, my favorite movie is the one with the least noise too. It's like, it just doesn't happen. It's like, man, did you see the new Avengers movie? The chromatic aberration was so well controlled. Like, no one's ever said these things. Even filmmakers don't notice these things unless they're pixel peeping and watching a movie for the third or fourth or fifth time. And that's, I guess, where we'll leave that discussion for now. Yeah. My question that I'm always curious about with people is just lens selection. Speaking of the hierarchy, lighting, we all have their own process. That's a different discussion for a different day. But I know me and you both are big into native Panasonic lenses, and I'm just really curious for people getting started, people who are picking up the GH6, the GH5 Mark II, anything Panasonic with the micro four thirds mount. What is your sort of like go-to workhorse lens? Like, what's the thing that's like made you the most money, sits on your camera the most often? I'm just curious about what it is you're using on a lot of these projects you do.
Yeah, I mean, I love a lot of the primes. This is a tough question because I am in love with so many different micro four thirds lenses. But I'll talk about the ones that have kind of like inspired me the most. I mean, one of the first lenses I ever used was the 12 to 35 f2.8 lens. It's a great documentary lens. But a few years later, they came out with the 8 to 18, which I just also love for like time lapses. And I feel like a lot of times if I'm ever only packing like two lenses, I end up with the 8 to 18 just because it can get like a beautiful wide shot or a time lapse. It's also a decent portrait lens. Going up to 18 millimeters is pretty good for like an interview. And then also this 25 prime, the f1 for 25 millimeter, is just a beautiful portrait lens. Great for photography and also great for like shooting an interview shot. So I feel, and they're both relatively lightweight. I mean, that's kind of what I like about the native lenses. So if I don't want to put too much in my bag, like I love the 42.5 millimeter prime, but it's kind of heavy. So it kind of only, I kind of only use it for like one thing, like like a specific kind of interview shot. But the lens that probably like, it's not even the most versatile, but I use it a lot for my podcast. And I've just always been kind of blown away by it, is this 12 millimeter that I'm shooting on right now. It's a 12 millimeter prime f1.4. And I think what kind of just blows my mind about it is that I can get a wide shot, but throw the background out of focus. And, I can do it right here in this room. I can exaggerate the distance of this room I'm in right now. And, the wall's only like 6 feet away from me, but I can throw it out of focus. And I like the way I look on a wide angle lens. It's kind of weird. I have to be careful. Like some people, if they're self-conscious about like the size of their nose or something, this is a lens that really exaggerates features. But I think it looks kind of cool to shoot wide angle with a shallow depth of field. So I kind of love this 12 millimeter and use it for every podcast shot.
Yeah, and that's one thing I noticed working with you on the GH5 Mark II video was that your lens setup was very prime heavy, which is not always the case for videographers and documentarians who sometimes like the flexibility of a zoom. And, it wasn't crazy cinema lenses or anything like that either. It was, I'm not going to say like a simple setup because you spent the time where it mattered on like camera movement and lighting and things like that. But these are relatively attainable pieces of gear. And yeah, it's just interesting because I'm the total opposite. I'm a zoom guy. I used the 12 to 35 for a long time. But these days I do the 20 or 10 to 25 Leica zoom lens, which is funny because I'm such a big micro four thirds guy, but I don't embrace.
You're talking about this giant, the giant f1.7 one?
Yep. I just, I don't embrace any of the benefits of micro four thirds being like cheaper or lighter. I just get the heaviest and most expensive zoom lens that they offer.
Well, it's okay that this one's giant because it does so much. It's 10 to 25. I'm actually holding it right now. It's not even mine. I borrowed it from work, but I think this lens is amazing. And if I had gone, back in 2013 when I was shooting Sriracha, I did it on the 12 to 35. But if this lens existed at the time, this would have been the lens. It's like the perfect documentary lens because 10 is even wider, and I love wide angle. 25 is probably just tight enough to get a beautiful portrait. And then I was having some low light struggles on that film. I mean, generally I was shooting in sunlight, so I was fine. But then anytime I tried to go into the dark, f2.8 was not ideal. And so to go to, f1.7 on that lens, I mean, that's got to be 3 times brighter. So that would be amazing.
Yeah, it really was just a numbers game for me. I was like, I've got, a Sigma 16 millimeter 1.4, a couple of primes, things like that, and they all got sold to pick up this lens, and it's I haven't regretted it at all. Just because I like you enjoy a wide angle perspective. I like 12 millimeters. I like 10 millimeters. I think 20 millimeters is more of a wide angle, obviously, than 24, but I think 24 barely feels wide anymore after I've used a 20 millimeter equivalent for so long. And yeah, and like you said with the focal length discussion, a lot of people I feel like think that the more telephoto your lens is, the more professional your shot looks, the better the person's going to look. But it's not always the case because sometimes, if you're too wide, you're going to get the nose and things like that exaggerated. But if you're too telephoto, I feel like you're going to get the ears or some other things like that exaggerated. So I would steer people away. I feel like usually people like a good middle ground in that 24 to 35 range. But, personally, I just have been trending wider angle for certain things over the years, just in general. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I mean, that's my personal style is I like being wide. So that's why I like the 8 to 18. I like the 10 to 25. I like the 12 to 35. I like all these zooms. But then I recognize many of the clients that I work with, they'll show me some work that they want me to continue a series or something. And it's generally, it generally kind of is like that stereotypical cinematic feel, which I think generally is tighter lenses. I think that's why you see me with those primes on set sometimes. I'm using the 25 millimeter f1.7 and the 42.5 f1.2, just because I kind of need to start from a tighter point of view to get the feel that the client is looking for. But if it's just me, if it's my personal taste, I like being up close to a subject. I think it's more intimate, as a filmmaker to walk up real close to someone, but then be able to zoom wide enough to capture what's happening, rather than essentially spying on them from across the room with the 42.5 or the 35 to 100 is a great zoom for getting that kind of distance shots. Right.
Would you say there's any particular thing about that focal length that if not too into psychology and things like that, but is it just the perspective? Does it feel more intimate because of just the connection you have with someone you're interviewing, for example? Or do you think it just feels more genuine because of things like smartphones that generally have wider angle lenses for usability, and that's what people associate with things like, documentaries that are more real, and opposed to corporate things or movies that are supposed to look professional and more cinematic, if you will. So can you break down your lens selection just a little bit from a psychological standpoint, or is it just more a feel thing for you that you just intuitively figured out over time?
I think it's kind of a relationship thing to the subject. I mean, there are times when I want to have a good relationship with my subject and then kind of disappear into the background so they forget that I'm there. And, a long lens is great for that. But a lot of times, I'm thinking about a piece that I shot in Alaska, and it's we're going through the bushes together, trying to be quiet and film some bears. And I want to be close to my subject, this photographer who is shooting the bears. And I mean, with a wide angle lens, I can literally keep the microphone on top of the camera and be 2 feet away from him, capture good audio, and be like intimately close with him in this environment and be, we can whisper to each other, but he still picks up on the microphone, and I could still zoom out wide enough that, it's not like a shot of just his chin and his forehead. Like I could still get like the world around him. And I think that's what I like about it. It's great for like, if you're actually moving through a space. It's great on a gimbal. The audience can feel the movement. Whereas like, if you're on a 25 millimeter lens, it's a great portrait shot, but if you're moving on a gimbal, it just doesn't, you're not going to feel the movement at all. And so I think that's why I like the wide angles, because it's just like, I think it's more immersive. It's more real. It may look less cinematic, or like, it may look less beautiful, but it feels more immersive to me, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the reason why you see these really immersive movies like The Revenant or something like that shot on, 18 millimeters, which would be in that, or 16 millimeters, something in that wide to ultra wide range, because, those movies really do make you forget that you're watching them partially because of the focal length they chose. So, I thought that was a great insight into sort of your process. And it's something I've been wondering ever since, watching you work on that GH5 Mark II video. I'm not sure this is different, but the second part of this question was not necessarily, your most used lens or your most versatile lens, but what is your favorite lens? What inspires you to take photos and videos? What shots from that lens always tend to blow you away? Again, this might be the same lenses for different reasons. It might be a different lens. I'm just curious, what is your quote unquote favorite lens to shoot with, and why?
I mean, it might be the 25 millimeter f1.4, just because, there's a lot of different lenses I use for video, and I think they all have, they all inspire me in different ways. But sometimes I find I'm only using this lens for photos, just because it's beautiful for shooting a portrait of my son or a headshot, or I kind of know it's the lens I'm going to use in a documentary production. It's like I could use any of these lenses to shoot B-roll, but I'm going to need this lens to film my host doing a stand-up, like my boss at the recount. I know he just looks really good on 25 millimeter. Everyone looks good on this lens. It's a very flattering lens. And so it's and it's also pretty small. So it's kind of the one I always make sure is packed, because it's going to get me the beautiful shot. Or if I brought a zoom with me, this one is a great pair with it, because it's going to be great in low light at f1.4. So I just know it can get me out of jams in a way that maybe some of the other lenses can't. So it's just always with me. It's like I'm shooting a video and someone says, "Oh, can you get some photos too?" It's like, well, that's the lens I'm probably going to use for photos. So I love that lens.
Yeah, it's a great lens. I've never had the chance to use it, but every time I see a picture with it, I'm just like, yeah, that Leica branding and optical design really, it's worth it for most of these lenses. The 10-25 we talked about is a Leica branded lens. I've owned the 42.5 1.2, and that was one of the lenses that unfortunately had to go to afford the 10-25, but I do miss it well, maybe not every day. That's a little dramatic, but occasionally I do really think man, for portraits and things like that, and the more 85 millimeter focal length, it's among the best options out there, if not the best option.
Yeah,
for the micro.
I find that
lenses.
In recent years, I've been using the 42.5 a lot for corporate work, but in my earlier days, I felt like I was using the 42.5 a lot to anytime I was doing parody, anytime I was making a comedy video that was supposed to look like a movie. It's like anytime I want to copy a Hollywood film style, that 42.5 is kind of like the focal length, like you said, 85 millimeter equivalent that you would see a lot in a traditional film. And because you can just blow the background out of focus, you could kind of shoot anything anywhere and make it look, quote, cinematic, without having to do a lot of production behind the shot. And it's just great in low light. So it was always kind of my trick. People would be like, "How did you make this look like a movie?" It's like, well, it was just that lens that did all the work.
And yeah, don't get me wrong, a telephoto fast aperture lens is super fun, does look super matic, but it can be kind of essential for certain shoots with a busy or distracting background, or a background that only looks good from a certain angle of view. You know, the 12 millimeter will look great on certain sets or in certain locations and environments that warrant that immersive look, but sometimes you're not in places that you really want to be immersed in, you know? So
Yeah.
having a tighter angle of view does have like practical value other than just making people look good or making things look cinematic. If you know, are in a backyard. I think I watched a video where these guys shot like a commercial in a backyard, and they're like, well, we don't want this fence, we don't want this house, we don't want this light pole or these wires, but there's like this one slice that looks great, so let's throw on a 7200, punch into 200, and now we could be in the middle of a forest with this great looking footage, and no one knows the wiser. So there is practical benefits to those longer focal lengths as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just personally, I like walking around a lot as a documentary filmmaker and really showing off the environment. And so like that lens, I get kind of stuck with it. Like it kind of has a few purposes for me, but you know, I'm not going to be able to walk around with it so much. I mean, I guess it'd be good for like kind of street photography where you're kind of like spying on someone from across the street. But, you know, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard for me to get the details I want in that very tight focal length.
Right. And that lens doesn't have the greatest minimum focus either. So you can't exactly get like the close-up macro shots either. I think the 12 and 25 get you better reproduction opposed to the 42.5. So yeah, it's
I also have to be careful with that f1.2 because like if I've used it for a lot of interviews, and if you're not careful, you know, if you pull it all the way to f1.2, like the nose will be a different focal distance than the top of the head. And so you could very easily accidentally like focus for like the middle of the head somehow, or if your subject just leans forward a little bit, they're suddenly completely out of focus. Yeah,
it's definitely a lens you gotta babysit a little bit more than your average, which is kind of why I prefer I have the 25 to 50 1.7 as well now. And those two lenses do pretty much everything for me. The 1.7 is a little bit more forgiving, and I'll go down to 2 or 2.2 even to really keep things in focus for interviews like that. But that's a great lens as well. I'd try to steal that from work as well if you can, because it is real fun to use, and the close-up focusing is really nice for those details and things like that. I use it on weddings for the rings a lot and things like that. So
nice.
I've avoided once again buying a macro lens, which I've just never been able to convince myself I need.
Yeah, no, I might have like some vintage lens that works as macro, but generally I'm not using that. And that's a cool thing about Micro Four Thirds is like I like the native lenses because I want them to take up as little space in my bag as possible, and you know, I don't want to have to carry a bunch of adapters around. But because these cameras have a very small flange distance, it means you can put just about any lens in the world on this camera. You just need the right adapter or spacer or speed booster or whatever it is. But they are very versatile cameras because of that.
Yeah, and you know, I love throwing weird vintage lenses, and you know, I think the funniest lenses I ever use for anything close to, you know, paid work is these. Have you seen these CCTV C-mount lenses? Have you used any of those before?
I have. And they're a pretty small, like, do they cover your entire sensor?
Yeah, they do actually. They're made for CCTV cameras, and I've got the 25 and 35, and I just ordered the 50 millimeter just for completionist's sake. And they do cover the sensor. The 25 actually, if you stop it down low enough, it doesn't cover the sensor anymore. So you can kind of only use it from like 4 to wide open, but they cost like $20 each, including like adapters and macro rings and everything. So they're almost so cheap, it's like a no-brainer to get. And so
oh yeah,
I might.
And generally, I love buying used lenses because they don't lose their value. You pretty much can buy a lens and then sell it 2 years later for the same price. So you're pretty much just renting lenses for the cost of inflation. You can always offload your lenses and get your value back.
I've actually seen a lot of people selling their vintage lenses at a profit, and I think I've only personally lost any amount of money on one or two lenses, and most of the time it's the same or more years later, which is the big difference between selling a lens and selling a camera body, which, you know, cameras get a lot dated a lot faster than your average lens. Anyway, that's all I had for you, actually, Griffin. Unless you have any final words to the audience about the GH6, Micro Four Thirds, Panasonic, or, you know, anything you've been up to lately. Do you have any projects or anything like that people should keep an eye on?
I like you mentioned at the beginning, I've started doing some live streaming. I kind of had to. I haven't done much on my channel in the last month on Twitch, just because I've been helping my workplace, The Recount, do a bunch of live streams. So I've been very behind the scenes for the last month. But you should definitely follow me on twitch.tv/Griffin Hammond, because I will, when I get a moment, get back into the live streaming game. Now that I feel like I'm a live streaming expert, I have all the gear and the experience now.
Yeah, you've been going on quite the journey with the live streams, and I've been trying myself to join in with as many as I can. What can people expect from you on your live streams? Do you do all camera stuff? Are you gaming over there? Are you talking politics? What's the vibe people can expect from some of your live streams when you get started back up with them again?
I've done a couple games, although that's not generally what my streams are about. I've been playing a little bit of Horizon Forbidden West and also Ghost of Tsushima on my PS5. But generally, my streams are filmmaking related, and we've done things like, you know, there's some things that are fun to test live, like an HDMI transmitter. We took it, me and my 3-year-old son took it outside, and we wanted to see how far away we could get from the house before it just like broke, like it stopped sending the signal to Twitch. And so that was kind of fun to have the audience along for that. And I've also done some like trivia games and things, trying to figure out what works pretty well in the interactive format. So I'm sure I'll do more games and more live reviews of equipment.
And yeah, I definitely recommend everybody go check out those streams. Check out the Hey Indie Filmmakers podcast. Like I said, it's really one of my favorite podcasts because, I don't know, you and Nick just have such a great dynamic. You guys bounce things off each other and have such different, you know, backgrounds in terms of your career paths and things like that. So, and you guys have a great back catalog as well. You guys don't upload quite as much as you used to, just because of everything that's been happening. And, you know, you're now a Twitch affiliate, I'm pretty sure. So, you know, there is that. But truly,
yeah, we keep getting more and more busy as dads. That, like, I think there was a time when we were doing a once a week podcast. So yeah, we do have a big back catalog. Now we're doing once a month podcast. Yeah,
the once a week was nice when it happened, but when you guys released an episode now, it's truly, you know, everything's saved up in the latest news and everything like that. So yeah, I would check out everything Griffin's done, the YouTube, the podcast, the Twitch, which is the new thing, and the streaming, and, you know, check him out on everything. Like I said, if you haven't heard of him somehow up to this point, or aren't familiar with all these new things he's been doing, I can't recommend it enough. And yeah, I just want to thank you, Griffin, for coming out and chatting about the GH6 and, you know, walking me through some of your thought process. I hope somebody out there somewhere was helped by our thought processes when it came to these cameras and lenses and things like that. And yeah, thanks again for stopping by. Maybe when the GH7 comes out, we'll chat again or something. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk Lumix gear, and thank you for having me on.
All right. See you guys later. And yeah, that's it.